Meet the forgotten Viking army that made England tremble at Stamford Bridge 1066. The morning mist clung to the Yorkshire meadows like a burial shroud, and through it came the sound of 10,000 warriors singing their death songs. They were the last great Viking army to set foot on English soil. And before the sun would set on that September day in 1066, most would lie dead beside the narrow wooden bridge that gave the battle its name. History remembers the Norman conquest that followed weeks later, but few recall the savage drama that unfolded at Stamford Bridge, where Harold Hardrada, the most feared warrior king of the north, led his berserkers and huscarls in one final glorious assault on the English crown. The men who marched with Hardrada were not ordinary soldiers. They were the inheritors of 3 centuries of Viking warfare, descendants of the sea wolves who had terrorized monasteries, sacked cities, and carved out kingdoms from Ireland to Russia. Each warrior carried within him the accumulated knowledge of generations of raiders, passed down from father to son in blood and iron. Their weapons were family heirlooms, pattern-welded swords with names like leg-biter and skull-splitter axes that had tasted the blood of Franks and Saxon spears that had pierced chainmail from Dublin to Constantinople. In the Viking camps scattered across the Orkney Islands that spring of 1066, men sharpened their weapons and spoke in hushed tones of the coming invasion. The preparation had been meticulous, years in the making. Harold Hardrada, whose very name meant hard ruler, had spent decades building alliances, gathering intelligence, and amassing the resources needed for this ultimate gamble. At 50 years old, he was a giant of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall, according to the sagas, with arms so long he could tie his sword belt without bending. His beard was still golden, despite his age, and his pale blue eyes held the cold intensity of a man who had survived 15 years of exile, countless battles, and the treacherous politics of 3 different royal courts. The army that answered his call was unlike any Viking force assembled in living memory. It drew warriors from across the Norse world, men who had fought in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium, raiders who had penetrated deep into Russia, along the river routes veterans of the Irish Wars, and young men eager to win glory and gold. Conservative estimates place their number at around 9,000 warriors, though some contemporary accounts suggest the force may have been larger. What set this army apart was not just its size, but its composition. These were professional soldiers, many of them members of the warrior aristocracy, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that Viking smiths could produce. The politics that brought this army to English shores were as complex as they were brutal. England in 1066 was a prize worth any risk. It was wealthy beyond the dreams of most Norsemen, with fertile lands, prosperous towns, and monasteries still fat with gold, despite centuries of Viking raids. The death of Edward the Confessor in January had created a succession crisis that Hardrada was determined to exploit. His claim to the English throne was tenuous at best, based on a supposed agreement between his predecessor Magnus the Good and Harthacnut, a Danish king of England, who had died in 1042. But in the violent world of medieval politics, claims mattered less than the strength to enforce them. The English king who stood in Hardrada's way was Harold Godwinson himself, a usurper in the eyes of many. Harold had seized the crown immediately after Edward's death, brushing aside the claims of William of Normandy and Edgar Atheling. He was an experienced military commander, having fought successful campaigns against the Welsh, but he faced threats from multiple directions. His own brother Tostig, the exiled Earl of Northumbria, had allied himself with Hardrada, providing the Norwegian king with crucial intelligence about English defenses and political divisions. The Viking fleet that set sail from Norway in early September was a magnificent sight. Contemporary sources speak of more than 300 ships, their square sails billowing in the North Sea, wind-dragon-headed prows cutting through the gray waters. The logistics of such an expedition were staggering. Each longship carried between 20 and 30 warriors, along with their weapons, armor provisions, and plunder from preliminary raids. The shallow draft vessels that had made Viking raids so effective for centuries were perfectly suited for navigating the rivers and estuaries of northern England. The first phase of the invasion went exactly as Hardrada had planned. The Viking fleet sailed up the Humber and along the River Ouse, penetrating deep into Yorkshire, before the English could mount an effective response. The psychological impact of their arrival cannot be overstated. For generations, English mothers had frightened their children with tales of Viking brutality. Now, the nightmare had returned in force. Towns and villages along the invasion route were abandoned as their inhabitants fled south, carrying with them tales of a vast Norse army led by a giant king who could not be killed in battle. On September 20th, the Vikings met their first serious resistance at Fulford, just south of York. The earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, had hastily assembled an army to defend the north. The battle that followed was a brutal affair, fought in marshy ground that negated the English advantage in heavy cavalry. The Viking army, fighting in their traditional wedge formation behind a wall of shields, gradually pushed the English back. As the day wore on, the battle became a slaughter. The English line broke, and hundreds of men drowned trying to escape across the treacherous wetlands. The earls survived, but their army was effectively destroyed. The victory at Fulford opened the gates of York, the second city of England, and the traditional capital of the North. The city's leading citizens, many of whom had Danish ancestry, and no love for their West Saxon overlords, negotiated a surrender that spared York from sack. Hardrada, showing the political acumen that had served him well throughout his career, accepted tribute and hostages, but refrained from the wholesale plunder that had characterized earlier Viking conquests. He needed York intact as a base for his planned campaign south. It was at this moment of triumph that Hardrada made the decision that would prove fatal. Rather than fortifying York and waiting for Harold Godwinson to come north, he moved his army to Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of the city. The site was chosen as a convenient location to receive additional hostages and supplies from the surrounding region. The Vikings, confident after their victory at Fulford, and believing the English king was still in the south preparing to face a Norman invasion, relaxed their guard. The speed of Harold Godwinson's response stunned contemporaries and continues to amaze historians. Upon learning of the Viking invasion, the English king gathered his household troops and whatever forces he could quickly muster, and began one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval military history. In just 4 days, his army covered the 190 miles from London to Tadcaster, arriving on September 24th. The core of this force consisted of Harold's elite household troops, the housecarl's professional warriors, armed with the fearsome, two-handed Danish axes that could split a shield, and the man behind it with a single blow. The morning of September 25th dawned warm and clear, unusual weather for late September in Yorkshire. The Viking army, spread out on both sides of the River Derwent, was completely unprepared for battle. Many warriors had left their heavy mail shirts with the ships at Rickall 10 miles away. They were expecting a day of negotiations and tribute gathering, not warfare. When the English army appeared on the western horizon advancing rapidly in battle formation, the shock in the Viking ranks was palpable. What followed was one of the most dramatic sequences in medieval warfare. The Vikings, on the west bank of the Derwent, caught completely off guard, fell back across Stamford Bridge in disorder. Legend speaks of a single Viking warrior, a giant berserker, who held the narrow bridge against the entire English army. Armed with a massive two-handed axe, he cut down every Englishman who tried to cross his weapon, rising and falling in a rhythm of death. The bridge became slippery with blood and bodies piled up at either end. Finally, an English soldier floated under the bridge in a half-barrel and thrust his spear up through the planking, mortally wounding the defender. With the bridge clear, the English army poured across. The main Viking force, rallying on the east bank, formed their traditional shield wall on the rising ground beyond the river. Hardrada, magnificent in his blue war cloak, took his place in the center of the line. Beside him stood his personal standard-bearer, holding aloft the famous Land-Waster banner, a raven flag that was said to guarantee victory if it flew freely, but foretold defeat if it hung limp. The king's helmet caught the sunlight as he moved along the line, encouraging his men, reminding them of their glorious ancestry and the shame of flight. The battle proper began with an exchange of missiles. English archers loosed volleys of arrows into the Viking ranks while the Norsemen responded with throwing spears and axes. Then came the grinding, brutal reality of medieval infantry combat. The two shield walls collided with a crash that could be heard a mile away. In the press of bodies, there was no room for sophisticated swordplay. Men stabbed with spears over the tops of shields, hooked axes over shield rims to drag opponents off balance, pushed with their shoulders to create gaps in the enemy line. For hours, the battle raged without either side gaining a decisive advantage. The Vikings, fighting with the desperation of men who knew there was no escape, held their ground against repeated English assaults. Harold Godwinson, fighting on foot among his housecarls, as was the English custom, personally led several charges against the Viking center, where Hardrada's banner flew. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of war cries, screams of the wounded, the clash of weapons on shields, and the dull thud of axes biting into flesh. The turning point came in mid-afternoon. During a brief lull in the fighting, Hardrada removed his helmet, perhaps to get a better view of the battlefield, or simply to cool himself in the unusually warm weather. At that moment, an English arrow, whether aimed or loose, struck him in the throat. The great Viking king, who had survived battles from Sicily to Jerusalem, fell dying in a Yorkshire meadow. The psychological impact on his army was devastating. These men had followed Hardrada across the North Sea, believing him to be invincible, protected by Odin himself. His death shattered that belief, and with it their cohesion. The Viking line began to waver, then break. Tostig Godwinson, fighting alongside his Norwegian allies against his own brother, tried to rally the troops. He, too, fell cut down by English axes, his body so mutilated that it could only be identified by distinctive marks known to his mistress. With both leaders dead, the Viking army disintegrated. What had been an organized fighting force became a mob of desperate men trying to escape the slaughter. The pursuit was merciless. English cavalry held in reserve during the main battle now came into their own, riding down fleeing Vikings across the open countryside. The road back to the ships at Rickhall became a killing ground. Exhausted Norsemen, many wounded, some still without armor, were cut down in their hundreds. Local peasants emerging from hiding places fell upon stragglers with agricultural tools, turned weapons, taking revenge for generations of Viking raids. Of the great army that had landed in England less than a week before, only a remnant reached the ships. Contemporary accounts suggest that of the 300 vessels that had brought the Vikings to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Prince Olaf Hardrada's son was among those who escaped, having been left with the ships, and thus missing the battle. Harold Godwinson, in a gesture that mixed magnanimity with practical politics, allowed the survivors to leave after they swore oaths never to attack England again. The immediate aftermath of Stamford Bridge was a scene from hell. The battlefield was carpeted with corpses so many that local accounts speak of the bones still being visible 50 years later. The task of stripping and burying the dead took days. Viking weapons and armor, much of it of the highest quality, were collected and distributed among the victorious English. The plunder was enormous. For many, Vikings had carried their portable wealth with them, expecting to add to it from English churches and towns. For Harold Godwinson, Stamford Bridge was both his greatest triumph and the beginning of his doom. He had defeated one of the most feared warriors of the age and destroyed the last great Viking invasion of England. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Many of his best warriors, the irreplaceable housecarls who formed the core of English military power, lay dead on the field. The army was exhausted from its forced march and savage battle, and even as Harold celebrated his victory in York, messengers arrived with news that William of Normandy had landed on the south coast. The king faced an impossible choice. His army needed rest and reinforcement, but every day of delay allowed William to strengthen his position and ravage the southern counties. Harold chose speed over preparation, beginning another forced march south that would end in disaster on Hastings Field. Many historians have speculated that had Stamford Bridge not occurred, or had it been a less costly victory, Harold might have defeated William as decisively as he had Hardrada. The Viking invasion intended to conquer England had instead fatally weakened it for the Norman conquest that followed. The warriors who died at Stamford Bridge represented the end of an era. They were the last generation of Vikings who could remember when the longships ruled the northern seas, and Norse warriors were the terror of Christendom. Many were the sons and grandsons of men who had carved out the Danelaw, established the Kingdom of York, and made England part of a North Sea empire under Knut the Great. Their defeat marked not just the failure of one invasion, but the end of 3 centuries of Viking expansion. The Viking military system that had made these conquests possible was already becoming obsolete by 1066, the rise of castle-based warfare. The increasing importance of heavy cavalry and the development of more sophisticated state structures meant that the traditional Viking raid was no longer as effective as it had once been. The warriors at Stamford Bridge, for all their individual skill and courage, were fighting with tactics and equipment that belonged to an earlier age. Their chainmail and round shields, effective against the opponents their fathers had faced, were increasingly vulnerable to the crossbows and heavy lances that were transforming European warfare. Yet it would be wrong to see Stamford Bridge simply as a clash between the old and new. The Viking army of 1066 was in many ways more sophisticated than its predecessors. These men were not the wild raiders of popular imagination, but disciplined professionals who understood complex battlefield tactics. Their shield wall formation, when properly executed, was still one of the most effective infantry tactics of the age. The problem was not their fighting methods, but their strategic situation caught by surprise far from their ships and sources of supply. The individual Vikings who fought at Stamford Bridge came from across the Norse world, each bringing their own story to the battlefield. There were Icelanders who had sailed for weeks to join Hardrada's expedition, seeing it as a chance to win fame and fortune in the tradition of their saga heroes. Norwegian jarls brought their household warriors men bound by oaths of loyalty that made retreat unthinkable. Danish mercenaries, professionals, who fought for whoever paid best, stood in the line because their reputation depended on it. Swedish adventurers, Orkney Islanders, even a few Irish Norse added their strength to the army. The weapons these men carried were works of art as much as tools of war. Viking smiths had perfected the technique of pattern welding, creating blades of extraordinary flexibility and sharpness. The best swords combined hard steel edges with softer iron cores, producing weapons that could bend without breaking and hold an edge through a long battle. The famous Ulfberht swords, marked with that mysterious name, were the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy. Axes ranged from simple hand weapons to massive two-handed varieties that could cleave through shield mail and bone. Spears, the most common weapon, came in various forms for both throwing and thrusting. Armor among the Viking army varied enormously based on wealth and status. The richest warriors wore mail hauberks that extended to their knees, made of thousands of interlocking iron rings. These could weigh 30 pounds or more, but provided excellent protection against slashing attacks. Helmets were typically conical with nose guards, some with mail aventails to protect the neck. Shields were round, about 3 feet in diameter, made of planked wood covered with leather and reinforced with iron rim and boss. Poorer warriors made do with leather armor or thick padded garments, trusting to their shields and agility for protection. The Viking tactical system at Stamford Bridge was based on the shield wall, a formation that had evolved over centuries of warfare. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. The front rank consisted of the best armed and most experienced fighters, often the huskarls or household troops of noble leaders. Behind them, men with spears could thrust over or between the shields. The formation required extraordinary discipline to maintain, especially when under attack. Any gap could be fatal, allowing enemies to break the line and attack from within. What made the Viking shield wall particularly effective was its flexibility. Unlike the rigid phalanxes of ancient times, the Norse formation could adapt to terrain and circumstances. Sections could advance or retreat independently. Wings could curve to prevent flanking, and the entire line could shift to meet threats from different directions. At Stamford Bridge, the Vikings demonstrated this flexibility by successfully forming a coherent defense, despite being surprised and initially scattered. The Berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, were present at Stamford Bridge, though their exact role is debated. These men dedicated to Odin worked themselves into a state of rage before battle, biting their shields and howling like wolves. In this condition, they seemed immune to pain and fear, fighting with a savagery that terrified enemies. Some scholars suggest they used psychoactive substances to induce this state, while others point to psychological techniques similar to those used by warriors in many cultures. Whatever the source of their fury, berserkers served as shock troops, breaking enemy lines through sheer ferocity. The command structure of the Viking army reflected both its multinational composition and the personal nature of medieval warfare. Hardrada, as king and war leader, held supreme command, but beneath him were numerous jarls and chieftains, each leading their own contingents. These leaders were not just military commanders, but also responsible for their men's welfare, sharing plunder, providing equipment to poorer warriors, and ensuring proper burial for the fallen. The loyalty between a lord and his warriors was personal and reciprocal, cemented by oaths, gifts, and shared dangers. Communication on the medieval battlefield was a constant challenge, and the Vikings at Stamford Bridge faced this problem in acute form. With the army spread out and surprised, coordinating an effective defense required exceptional leadership. Battle standards served as rallying points and communication tools. The position and movement of Hardrada's Landwaster banner told warriors where to form up and which direction to face. Horn signals, drum beats, and the war cries of different contingents helped maintain some cohesion in the chaos of battle. When these systems broke down with Hardrada's death, the army's collapse was swift. The role of religion in motivating the Viking army cannot be underestimated. While some Norwegians had converted to Christianity, by 1066, many warriors still followed the old gods. They fought believing that death in battle guaranteed entry to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. This belief system made Viking warriors extraordinarily dangerous opponents, willing to take risks that more rational soldiers might avoid. Christian Vikings fought with equal fervor, seeing the expedition as a righteous war to claim a throne they believed was legitimately Hardrada's. The logistics that supported the Viking army were remarkable for their time. Feeding 9,000 men required careful planning and efficient foraging. The fleet that transported them served as a mobile base, carrying not just warriors but also craftsmen, merchants, and camp followers. Blacksmiths traveled with the army to repair weapons and armor. Healers, using a combination of practical knowledge and magic, tended the wounded. Skalds, the poet-historians of the Norse world, accompanied the expedition to record its deeds in verse that would outlive the participants. The intelligence network that enabled the invasion deserves recognition. Tostig Godwinson provided detailed information about English defenses, politics, and geography. Viking merchants who had traded in York for generations offered insights into local conditions. The Norse diaspora, scattered across Britain and Ireland, furnished intelligence and support. This network allowed Hardrada to plan his campaign with remarkable precision, choosing the optimal time and place for invasion. Only Harold Godwinson's unexpected speed prevented this planning from bearing fruit. Weather played a crucial role in the Stamford Bridge campaign. The unusually warm September day that saw the battle put the mail-clad Vikings at a disadvantage, contributing to their decision to leave much of their armor with the ships. The same weather that had provided ideal conditions for the sea crossing now worked against them on land. Exhaustion from heat, combined with the shock of surprise, reduced the effectiveness of even veteran warriors. Had the battle occurred on a typical cool, rainy Yorkshire day, the outcome might have been different. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. In Norway, the loss of so many warriors, including the king, and much of the aristocracy, created a power vacuum that took years to fill. The kingdom entered a period of civil strife as various claimants fought for the throne. The economic impact was severe, as the resources invested in the invasion were lost along with the plunder that might have offset them. For a generation, Norway turned inward, abandoning the expansionist policies that had characterized Hardrada's reign. In the wider Norse world, Stamford Bridge marked a psychological turning point. The age of Viking expansion, which had begun in the late 8th century, with the raid on Lindisfarne, effectively ended in that Yorkshire meadow. Future Norse military adventures would be different in character, more often defensive than offensive. more likely to involve negotiation than naked aggression. The Viking diaspora increasingly integrated, with local populations abandoning their distinctive warrior culture for the settled life of landowners and merchants. The English perspective on Stamford Bridge was complex. On one hand, it was celebrated as a great victory proof that English arms could defeat even the most feared enemies. On the other, the battle's cost became apparent just 3 weeks later, when Harold faced William at Hastings with a weakened, exhausted army. Some contemporary chroniclers explicitly blamed the defeat at Hastings on the losses suffered at Stamford Bridge, the north of England devastated by the Viking invasion, and subsequent Norman harrying took generations to recover. For military historians, Stamford Bridge offers crucial insights into the nature of medieval warfare. The battle demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the shield wall formation. It showed how surprise and speed could overcome numerical superiority and better equipment. The importance of leadership was starkly illustrated by the Viking collapse following Hardrada's death. The battle also revealed the changing nature of warfare, as the mobility that had been the Vikings' greatest advantage became a liability when they were caught far from their ships. The archaeological evidence from Stamford Bridge continues to emerge, offering new perspectives on the battle. Weapon finds confirm the ferocity of the fighting, with broken sword blades, shattered spear points, and deformed axe heads testifying to the violence of the clash. Analysis of skeletal remains reveals the horrific injuries inflicted by medieval weapon skulls, split by axes, bones shattered by mace blows, deep cuts from swords that would have caused rapid death from blood loss. These finds bring home the brutal reality behind the heroic narratives of the sagas and chronicles. The cultural memory of Stamford Bridge took different forms in different places. In England, it became part of the narrative of 1066, overshadowed by Hastings, but still remembered as Harold's great victory. In Scandinavia, it entered the saga tradition transformed into a tale of heroic defeat, where individual prowess mattered more than strategic outcome. The story of the lone Viking defending the bridge became a symbol of Norse courage retold and embellished through generations. In Iceland, where many of the sagas were written down, Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking age that had defined their cultural identity. Modern perceptions of the Vikings who fought at Stamford Bridge have been shaped by both scholarly research and popular culture. The image of horn-helmeted barbarians has given way to a more nuanced understanding of sophisticated warriors operating within a complex military and social system. These men were products of a warrior culture that valued courage, loyalty, and skill at arms above all else. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers who had created a network spanning from Greenland to Constantinople. Their defeat at Stamford Bridge ended one chapter of European history, while opening another. The legacy of the Viking army at Stamford Bridge extends beyond military history into questions of identity and cultural memory. For modern Norwegians, these warriors represent a complex heritage, simultaneously a source of national pride and embarrassment. The violence and aggression of the Viking Age sits uneasily with contemporary Scandinavian values of peace and cooperation. Yet the courage and adventurous spirit of men like Hardrada continue to inspire, reminding us that history is never simple, never purely heroic or villainous. The tactical lessons of Stamford Bridge influenced military thinking for generations. The vulnerability of even elite infantry, when surprised, became a cautionary tale for medieval commanders. The importance of intelligence and reconnaissance was reinforced by Hardrada's fatal lack of information about Harold's movements. The battle also demonstrated the continued relevance of forced marches and rapid deployment capabilities that would remain crucial to military success well into the modern era. English commanders studying the battle learned both what to do from Harold's swift response and what not to do from Hardrada's overconfidence. The economic dimensions of the Viking expedition to Stamford Bridge reveal much about medieval warfare. The cost of assembling such an army was enormous, requiring years of accumulation of resources. Ships had to be built or purchased weapons, and armor, manufactured provisions gathered, and warriors recruited with promises of pay and plunder. Hardrada had mortgaged Norway's future on this invasion, and its failure left the kingdom impoverished. The economic motivation of the warriors themselves varied from those seeking quick plunder to others hoping to win English lands and settle permanently. The role of women in the Stamford Bridge campaign, though largely absent from battlefield accounts, was nonetheless significant. Norse women managed estates and businesses while their men were on campaign. They provided much of the economic support that made such expeditions possible. Some women traveled with the army as camp followers, providing essential services from cooking to medical care. The aftermath of the battle left thousands of Norse women widowed, forcing them to take on roles traditionally reserved for men. Their resilience in the face of catastrophic loss helped Norse society survive the disaster. The medical realities of Stamford Bridge were grim by any standard. Battle injuries in the medieval period were frequently fatal, with infection killing as many as died from immediate wounds. Viking medical knowledge, while advanced for its time, could do little for men with penetrating wounds to the torso or severe head injuries. Treatment consisted primarily of wound-cleaning simple surgery to remove arrowheads or bone fragments and herbal remedies. The lucky survivors often faced permanent disability, ending their careers as warriors and forcing them to find other means of survival. The psychological impact of Stamford Bridge on its survivors cannot be quantified, but must have been profound. Men who had left Norway, confident of victory and wealth, returned defeated and impoverished. Many had seen friends and kinsmen cut down before their eyes. The survivors faced not just physical hardships, but the emotional trauma of defeat and the social shame of having fled from battle. Some found solace in religion, others in drink, still others in the composition of poetry that transformed defeat into a kind of literary victory. The naval aspects of the Viking expedition deserve examination. The longships that carried Hardrada's army represented the pinnacle of Norse maritime technology. These vessels, with their shallow draft and flexible construction, could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. Their speed under both sail and oar gave Vikings strategic mobility unmatched in their era. The logistics of coordinating a fleet of 300 ships across the North Sea required exceptional seamanship and organization. The abandonment of most of these ships after Stamford Bridge represented a massive loss of capital investment and technological capability. The intelligence failure that led to the disaster at Stamford Bridge offers lessons still relevant today. Hardrada's information about English political divisions was accurate but incomplete. He knew about Harold's problems with Tostig and the Norman threat, but failed to appreciate the English king's ability to respond rapidly to multiple threats. The Viking intelligence network, impressive as it was, could not provide real-time information about enemy movements. This limitation, combined with overconfidence born of initial success, created the conditions for catastrophic surprise. The diplomatic context of the 1066 invasions reveals the interconnected nature of medieval European politics. Hardrada's invasion was coordinated, whether deliberately or coincidentally, with William's Norman expedition. Both invaders hoped to exploit England's apparent weakness and division. The Pope's support for William's claim added a religious dimension to what was essentially a struggle for power and wealth. English diplomacy failed to prevent either invasion, leaving Harold to face both threats with military force alone. The failure of negotiation made Stamford Bridge inevitable. Climate and agriculture played understated but important roles in the Viking expedition. The medieval warm period that characterized the 11th century had made Scandinavian agriculture more productive, supporting larger populations and enabling military adventures. The same warming that opened Greenland to Norse settlement also created the economic surpluses necessary for major military expeditions. Conversely, the agricultural wealth of England, enhanced by the same climatic conditions, made it an irresistible target for ambitious rulers like Hardrada. The transformation of Viking military culture by 1066 reflected broader changes in Norse society. The old ideal of the independent warrior seeking individual glory was giving way to more organized, hierarchical military structures. The men who fought at Stamford Bridge were more likely to be retained soldiers than seasonal raiders. This professionalization of warfare required different economic arrangements, with lords maintaining permanent military households rather than assembling temporary forces for summer raids. The defeat at Stamford Bridge accelerated this transformation by eliminating many traditionalists. The linguistic evidence from Stamford Bridge period provides insights into the cultural interactions of the time. The Norse spoken by Hardrada's army was still mutually intelligible with the English of Yorkshire, where Scandinavian settlement had been heavy. This linguistic closeness facilitated intelligence gathering and negotiation, but also highlighted the artificial nature of ethnic divisions. Many English fighters at Stamford Bridge had Norse ancestry, while some Vikings had been born in England. The battle was as much a civil war as a foreign invasion. The artistic legacy of Stamford Bridge found expression in various media. Skaldic poetry, the complex verse form favored by Norse courts, preserved accounts of the battle that emphasized individual heroism over strategic failure. English chroniclers writing in Latin focused on divine providence and the righteousness of Harold's cause. Later, medieval artists depicted the battle in manuscripts and tapestries, though these often conflated it with Hastings. Each artistic tradition shaped memory of the event to serve contemporary purposes. The geographical significance of Stamford Bridge extended beyond its tactical importance. The site controlled crossing of the Derwent River and access to York from the east. Its selection as a meeting place for receiving hostages made strategic sense in normal circumstances. The broader geography of Yorkshire, with its river systems and Roman roads, had attracted Norse settlers for centuries. The landscape itself bore the marks of Scandinavian influence in place names and field patterns. The battle was fought on ground that was as much Norse as English. Technological factors beyond weapons and armor influenced the battle's outcome. The Roman road system that Harold used for his rapid march remained superior to anything in Scandinavia. English logistics, based on royal estates and urban centers, could support rapid military movements in ways the Vikings' ship-based system could not match away from water. The technology of fortification, though not directly relevant at Stamford Bridge, formed the strategic background. Vikings excelled at mobile warfare, but struggled against well-fortified positions. The religious dimensions of Stamford Bridge went beyond simple Christian versus pagan conflict. By 1066, most Norwegians were nominally Christian, though pagan practices persisted. The English church, more thoroughly Christianized, still contained syncretistic elements. Both armies included Christians who saw their cause as divinely sanctioned. The role of battlefield clergy providing last rites and spiritual comfort was established on both sides. Religious rhetoric justified violence, while religious institutions profited from victory. The seasonal timing of the Stamford Bridge campaign followed traditional Viking patterns. Late summer and early fall provided optimal conditions for both sailing and campaigning. Harvest time meant maximum availability of supplies for foraging armies. The approach of winter added urgency to the campaign, as Hardrada needed to establish himself before weather made military operations impossible. Harold's rapid response disrupted this timeline, forcing battle before the Vikings were properly established. The unseasonably warm weather that favored the invasion initially became a liability during the battle. Social stratification within the Viking army at Stamford Bridge mirrored broader Norse society. At the apex stood Hardrada and the Jarl's men, who combined military leadership with political authority and economic power. Below them ranked the professional warriors huskarls and hardmen, who exchanged military service for land and privileges. The bulk of the army consisted of free farmers and craftsmen, fulfilling military obligations or seeking profit. At the bottom were thralls and servants, present in supporting roles but excluded from combat. This hierarchy influenced battlefield deployment and post-battle distribution of plunder. The comparative analysis of Stamford Bridge with other battles of the Viking Age reveals both continuities and changes. Like the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 or Hjörungavágr in 986, it demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined infantry formations. Unlike earlier Viking victories, it showed the increasing importance of strategic mobility and intelligence. The scale exceeded most Viking Age battles, reflecting the resources available to an established kingdom, rather than raiding parties. The decisive nature of the defeat, with no opportunity for the negotiated settlements common in Norse warfare, marked a departure from tradition. Environmental factors beyond weather affected the battle. The terrain around Stamford Bridge, relatively flat with gentle slopes, favored the close combat at which Vikings excelled. The river provided a natural defensive barrier, but also trapped the Vikings when surprised. Vegetation and visibility conditions influenced tactical decisions. The acoustic properties of the battlefield, with the river valley focusing sound, added to the psychological impact of war cries and clashing weapons. Even factors like the angle of the sun at different times of day played roles in the fighting. The economic aftermath of Stamford Bridge extended throughout the North Sea world. Norse merchants lost access to English markets, disrupting established trade networks. The wealth that would have flowed to Scandinavia from a successful invasion instead remained in or returned to England. Craftsmen who specialized in military equipment faced reduced demand. The disruption of normal economic activity by the military campaign affected agriculture and industry. Recovery took years and contributed to the reorientation of Norse economies away from raiding toward more peaceful pursuits. Demographic consequences of Stamford Bridge shaped medieval Scandinavia. The loss of thousands of young men created imbalances in Norse society. Marriage patterns shifted as women outnumbered eligible men. Inheritance disputes multiplied as direct heirs died without issue. Some regions lost significant portions of their adult male population, affecting agricultural production and defense capabilities. The demographic shock contributed to political instability and social change. Population recovery took a generation, by which time Norse society had fundamentally changed. The immediate aftermath of Stamford Bridge was a scene from hell. The battlefield, stretching across the meadows and the river banks, was carpeted with corpses, so many that local accounts speak of the bones still being visible. 50 years later, bleached white monuments to a forgotten slaughter. The air once thick with war cries now hung heavy with the stench of blood and the silence of death, broken only by the mournful caws of ravens descending. The grim task of stripping the dead of their valuables and burying the bodies, a macabre harvest for the victors, took days. Viking weapons and armor, much of it of the highest quality, were collected and distributed among the victorious English, a grim bounty for their suffering. The plunder was enormous, for many Vikings had carried their portable wealth with them, expecting to add to it from English churches and towns. Their dreams of riches had become the spoils of their conquerors. For Harold Godwinson, Stamford Bridge was both his greatest triumph and the beginning of his doom. He had defeated one of the most feared warriors of the age and destroyed the last great Viking invasion of England. The kingdom was saved from the Northmen, a feat that would have earned any king eternal glory. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Many of his best warriors, the irreplaceable housecarls, who formed the iron core of English military power, lay dead on the field. Their elite training and unwavering loyalty could not be replaced overnight. The army was exhausted from its grueling forced march from London and the savage hours-long battle, and even as Harold celebrated his hard-won victory in York, a shadow loomed from the south. Messengers, their horses lathered with foam, arrived with news that William of Normandy had landed on the south coast, bringing with him another equally formidable invading army. The English king faced an impossible choice. His army desperately needed rest and reinforcement, but every single day of delay allowed William to strengthen his beachhead forage for supplies and ravage the southern counties, eroding English morale and resources. Harold, a man defined by decisive action, chose speed over preparation, beginning another forced march south that would culminate just weeks later in disaster on Hastings Field. Many historians have speculated that had Stamford Bridge not occurred, or had it been a less costly victory, Harold might have defeated William as decisively as he had Hardrada. The Viking invasion intended to conquer England for the north had instead fatally weakened it, paving the way for the Norman conquest that would fundamentally reshape England's destiny. The warriors who died at Stamford Bridge represented the end of an era. They were the last generation of Vikings who could remember a time when the dragon-headed longships ruled the northern seas, and Norse warriors were the undisputed terror of Christendom. Many were the sons and grandsons of men who had carved out the Danelaw, established the powerful kingdom of York, and made England part of a vast North Sea empire under Knut the Great. Their defeat marked not just the failure of one audacious invasion, but the definitive end of 3 centuries of Viking expansion, a tide of conquest that had ebbed and flowed across Europe for generations. The Viking military system that had made these conquests possible was by 1066 already becoming obsolete. The rise of castle-based warfare, which offered impregnable strongholds against raiders, the increasing importance of heavy cavalry, capable of breaking shield walls with crushing force, and the development of more sophisticated centralized state structures meant that the traditional Viking raid, swift and devastating, was no longer as effective as it had once been. The warriors at Stamford Bridge, for all their individual skill and breathtaking courage, were fighting with tactics and equipment that, while honed over centuries, belonged to an earlier age. Their chainmail and round shields, effective against the opponents their fathers had faced, were increasingly vulnerable, to the concentrated volleys of crossbows and the devastating impact of heavy lances that were rapidly transforming European warfare. Yet, it would be wrong to see Stamford Bridge simply as a clash between the old and new. The Viking army of 1066 was in many ways more sophisticated than its predecessors. These men were not the wild, disorganized raiders of popular imagination, but disciplined professionals who understood complex battlefield tactics. Their shield wall formation, when properly executed, was still one of the most effective infantry tactics of the age. The problem was not their fighting methods, which remained formidable, but their disastrous strategic situation, caught by surprise far from their ships, and vital sources of supply fighting a battle on ground not of their choosing. The individual Vikings who fought at Stamford Bridge came from across the vast Norse world, each bringing their own unique story to the battlefield. There were hardy Icelanders, who had sailed for weeks, braving treacherous seas to join Hardrada's grand expedition, seeing it as a chance to win lasting fame and unimaginable fortune in the proud tradition of their saga heroes. Norwegian jarls arrived with their loyal household warriors, men bound by ancient oaths of loyalty that made any thought of retreat unthinkable, preferring death to dishonor. Danish mercenaries, professional soldiers, who fought for whoever paid best, stood steadfast in the line for their very reputation, and future livelihoods depended on their unwavering performance. Swedish adventurers, stoic Orkney Islanders, even a few Irish Norse, whose ancestors had settled in Hibernia, added their strength to the diverse and formidable army. The weapons these men carried were not merely tools of war. They were works of art imbued with history and legend. Viking smiths had perfected the arduous technique of pattern welding, creating blades of extraordinary flexibility and razor sharpness. The finest swords combined hard steel edges with softer iron cores, producing weapons that could bend without breaking and hold a deadly edge through the longest, most brutal battle. The famous Ulfbert swords, marked with that mysterious name, represented the pinnacle of medieval metallurgy, coveted across Europe. Axes ranged from simple, devastating hand weapons to massive two-handed varieties that could cleave through shield mail and bone with a single brutal swing. Spears, the most common weapon, came in various forms for both precision throwing and powerful thrusting, versatile and deadly in any combat situation. Armor among the Viking army varied enormously based on individual wealth and social status. The richest warriors wore gleaming mail hauberks that extended to their knees, made of thousands of interlocking iron rings. These could weigh 30 pounds or more, but provided excellent protection against slashing attacks from swords and axes. Helmets were typically conical, with nose guards, some equipped with mail aventails to protect the neck and cheeks. Shields were universally round, about 3 feet in diameter, constructed from planked wood covered with hardened leather, and reinforced with an iron rim and a central boss. Poorer warriors, unable to afford costly mail, made do with simpler leather armor, or thick, padded garments, trusting to their agile movements and the strength of their shields for protection. The Viking tactical system at Stamford Bridge was fundamentally based on the shield wall, a formidable formation that had evolved and been perfected over centuries of Norse warfare. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their large round shields overlapping, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier of wood and iron. The front rank consisted of the best armed and most experienced fighters, often the huscarls, or household troops of noble leaders who bore the brunt of the initial enemy assault. Behind them, men armed with long spears could thrust over or between the shields, adding to the defensive and offensive power. This formation required extraordinary discipline and unwavering courage to maintain, especially when under the brutal pressure of a concentrated attack. Any single gap could be fatal, allowing enemies to break the line and attack from within, unraveling the entire formation. What made the Viking shield wall particularly effective was its inherent flexibility. Unlike the rigid, less adaptable phalanxes of ancient times, the Norse formation could adapt dynamically to changing terrain and battlefield circumstances. Sections could advance or retreat independently. Wings could curve inwards to prevent flanking maneuvers, and the entire line could fluidly shift to meet threats from different directions with surprising speed. At Stamford Bridge, the Vikings demonstrated this remarkable flexibility by successfully forming a coherent, albeit desperate, defense, despite being caught completely by surprise and initially scattered across the river. The Berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, were indeed present at Stamford Bridge, though their exact role and impact in the battle remain debated among historians. These men, dedicated to Odin and driven by an intense, almost supernatural rage, would work themselves into a frenzied state before battle, biting their shields and howling like wild wolves. In this terrifying condition, they seemed immune to pain and fear, fighting with a raw, almost animalistic savagery that truly terrified their enemies, and often broke the initial enemy lines through sheer brutal ferocity. Some scholars suggest they might have used psychoactive substances to induce this state, while others point to intense psychological techniques similar to those employed by warriors in many cultures across history. The command structure of the Viking army at Stamford Bridge reflected both its multinational composition and the deeply personal nature of medieval warfare. Harald Hardrada, as the king and ultimate war leader, held supreme command, but beneath him were numerous jarls and chieftains, each leading their own distinct contingents of warriors. These leaders were not just military commanders, but also held immense responsibility for their men's welfare, sharing the spoils of plunder, fairly providing equipment to poorer warriors, and ensuring proper burial for the fallen. The loyalty between a lord and his warriors was intensely personal and reciprocal, cemented by sacred oaths, generous gifts, and countless shared dangers and triumphs on the battlefield. Communication on the chaotic, brutal medieval battlefield was a constant challenge, and the Vikings at Stamford Bridge faced this problem in its most acute form. With the army spread out and caught by surprise, coordinating an effective defense required exceptional leadership and rapid dissemination of orders. Battle standards such as Hardrada's famous Land Waster banner served as vital rallying points and primary communication tools. The position and movement of the banner told warriors where to form up and which direction to face. Horn signals, rhythmic drum beats, and the thunderous war cries of different contingents helped maintain some semblance of cohesion in the overwhelming chaos of battle. When these vital communication systems broke down with Hardrada's sudden death, the army's collapse was swift and irreversible. The role of religion in motivating the Viking army cannot be underestimated. While some Norwegians had converted to Christianity, by 1066, many warriors still fiercely followed the Old Norse gods, particularly Odin the All-Father. They fought believing that death in glorious battle guaranteed entry to Valhalla, the grand hall of slain warriors, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. This powerful belief system made Viking warriors extraordinarily dangerous opponents, willing to take suicidal risks that more rational soldiers might avoid. Even Christian Vikings fought with equal fervor, seeing the expedition as a righteous war to claim a throne they believed was legitimately Hardrada's by ancient right. The logistics that supported the Viking army were truly remarkable, for their time a testament to meticulous planning and adaptation. Feeding 9,000 men even for a few weeks required careful planning and incredibly efficient foraging from the land. The magnificent fleet of longships that transported them served as a mobile base carrying not just warriors, but also essential craftsmen, shrewd merchants, and numerous camp followers who provided crucial support services. Blacksmiths traveled with the army to repair and sharpen weapons and armor on the go. Healers, employing a combination of practical knowledge and traditional Norse magic, tirelessly tended to the wounded. Skalds, the revered poet-historians of the Norse world, accompanied the expedition to meticulously record its deeds in vivid verse that would outlive the participants, ensuring their glory was remembered. The intelligence network that enabled the invasion, though, ultimately flawed by Harold's speed, deserves significant recognition. Tostig Godwinson, the exiled English earl, provided invaluable and detailed information about English defenses, political divisions within the kingdom, and local geography. Viking merchants who had traded in York for generations offered deep insights into local conditions and potential resources. The vast Norse diaspora, scattered across Britain and Ireland, furnished additional intelligence and crucial support. This extensive network allowed Hardrada to plan his campaign with remarkable precision, choosing the optimal time and place for his landing and initial advance. It was only Harold Godwinson's wholly unexpected speed and relentless forced march that prevented this meticulous planning from bearing its intended fruit. Weather played a crucial and often overlooked role in the Stamford Bridge campaign. The unusually warm September day that saw the battle put the mail-clad Vikings at a distinct disadvantage, contributing to their fatal decision to leave much of their heavy armor with the ships at Rickall, 10 miles away. The same unseasonably mild weather that had provided ideal conditions for the sea crossing now ironically worked against them on land, causing immense heat exhaustion. This fatigue, combined with the profound shock of the English army's surprise appearance, severely reduced the effectiveness of even these veteran Viking warriors. Had the battle occurred on a typical cool, rainy Yorkshire day, the outcome might have been dramatically different, perhaps even tilting the scales in favor of the Northmen. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, rippling through the North Sea world for years. In Norway, the catastrophic loss of so many elite warriors, including the king and a significant portion of the aristocracy, created a dangerous power vacuum that took years to fill. The kingdom plunged into a period of debilitating civil strife, as various claimants fought fiercely for the vacant throne. The economic impact was severe, as the immense resources invested in the failed invasion were lost along with the vast plunder that might have offset them. For an entire generation, Norway turned inward, abandoning the ambitious expansionist policies that had characterized Hardrada's long and eventful reign. In the wider Norse world, Stamford Bridge marked a profound psychological turning point. The age of Viking expansion, which had burst onto the European stage in the late 8th century with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne, effectively ended in that blood-soaked Yorkshire meadow. Future Norse military adventures would be fundamentally different in character, more often defensive than offensive, more likely to involve complex negotiation and diplomacy than naked aggression and brute force. The vibrant Viking diaspora across Europe, increasingly integrated with local populations, gradually abandoning their distinctive warrior culture, for the more settled agrarian life of landowners and merchants, signifying a profound cultural shift. The English perspective on Stamford Bridge was complex and deeply interwoven with the events that followed. On one hand, it was immediately celebrated as a monumental victory, undeniable proof that English arms could defeat even the most feared enemies of the age. On the other hand, the battle's devastating cost became painfully apparent just 3 weeks later, when Harold Godwinson faced William of Normandy at Hastings with a desperately weakened, exhausted army. Some contemporary chroniclers explicitly blamed the catastrophic defeat at Hastings on the irreplaceable losses suffered at Stamford Bridge, the north of England already devastated by the Viking invasion, and the subsequent brutal Norman harrying took generations to truly recover from the dual traumas. For military historians, Stamford Bridge continues to offer crucial enduring insights into the nature of medieval warfare. The battle starkly demonstrated both the formidable strengths and the inherent limitations of the vaunted shield wall formation. It showed how devastatingly effective surprise and overwhelming speed could be in overcoming even numerical superiority and better equipment. The critical importance of decisive leadership was starkly illustrated by the Viking collapse following Hardrada's death. The battle also vividly revealed the changing nature of warfare, as the strategic mobility that had been the Vikings' greatest advantage throughout their expansion became a fatal liability when they were caught far from their ships and lines of retreat. The archaeological evidence from Stamford Bridge continues to emerge gradually, offering new and tantalizing perspectives on the battle itself and its immediate aftermath. Weapon finds confirm the truly astonishing ferocity of the fighting, with broken sword blades, shattered spear points, and deformed axe heads testifying to the unimaginable violence of the clash. Analysis of skeletal remains, where possible, reveals the horrific injuries inflicted by medieval weapon skulls, split by axe blows, bones shattered by mace, impacts, deep gaping cuts from swords that would have caused rapid death from blood loss. These grim finds bring home the brutal, unromanticized reality that lay behind the heroic narratives of the sagas and chronicles. The cultural memory of Stamford Bridge took different powerful forms in different places across the Norse and English worlds. In England, it became an integral part of the larger narrative of 1066, though inevitably overshadowed by the cataclysmic events at Hastings. Yet it was still proudly remembered as Harold's great and valiant victory. In Scandinavia, it entered the revered saga tradition, transformed into a poignant tale of heroic defeat, where individual prowess and unwavering courage mattered more than the ultimate strategic outcome. The story of the lone Viking defending the bridge became a powerful symbol of Norse bravery, retold and embellished through countless generations. In Iceland, where many of the great sagas were meticulously written down centuries later, Stamford Bridge was universally recognized as the definitive end of the Viking Age, the era that had profoundly shaped their entire cultural identity. Modern perceptions of the Vikings who fought at Stamford Bridge have been profoundly shaped by both rigorous scholarly research and the pervasive influence of popular culture. The simplistic image of horned, helmeted barbarians has largely given way to a more nuanced and accurate understanding of sophisticated warriors operating within a complex military and intricate social system. These men were indeed products of a warrior culture that valued immense courage, unyielding loyalty, and formidable skill at arms above all else. But they were also shrewd traders, intrepid explorers, and resilient settlers who had forged a vast network spanning from the icy reaches of Greenland all the way to the bustling markets of Constantinople. Their climactic defeat at Stamford Bridge effectively ended one monumental chapter of European history, while irrevocably opening another. The legacy of the Viking army at Stamford Bridge extends far beyond mere military history, delving deep into complex questions of identity and cultural memory. For modern Norwegians, these ancient warriors represent a complex and often contradictory heritage, simultaneously a potent source of intense national pride and at times a degree of embarrassment. The pervasive violence and raw aggression of the Viking Age sit uneasily with contemporary Scandinavian values of peace cooperation and social welfare. Yet the undeniable courage, the daring, adventurous spirit, and the unparalleled resilience of men like Harald Hardrada continue to inspire, serving as a powerful reminder that history is never simple, never purely heroic or villainous, but a complex tapestry of human endeavor. The tactical lessons gleaned from Stamford Bridge influenced military thinking for generations across Europe. The stark vulnerability of even elite infantry, when caught by surprise, became a cautionary tale for countless medieval commanders. The critical importance of accurate intelligence and thorough reconnaissance was powerfully reinforced by Hardrada's fatal lack of information about Harald's rapid movements. The battle also vividly demonstrated the continued relevance of forced marches and rapid deployment military capabilities that would remain absolutely crucial to success well into the modern era. English commanders studying the battle learned both what to do from Harold's swift and decisive response and what not to do from Hardrada's fatal overconfidence. The economic dimensions of the Viking expedition to Stamford Bridge reveal much about the inherent costs and motivations of medieval warfare. The staggering cost of assembling and equipping such an army was enormous, requiring years of meticulous accumulation of vast resources. Ships had to be painstakingly built or purchased countless weapons, and armor manufactured, provisions gathered, and warriors recruited with enticing promises of substantial pay and plunder. Hardrada had literally mortgaged Norway's future on this audacious invasion, and its catastrophic failure left the kingdom deeply impoverished for years. The economic motivation of the warriors themselves varied from those seeking quick, lucrative plunder to others, hoping to win English lands and settle permanently, establishing new Norse communities. The role of women in the Stamford Bridge campaign, though largely absent from traditional battlefield accounts, was nonetheless profoundly significant. Norse women managed vast estates and intricate businesses, while their men were on campaign providing much of the essential economic support that made such ambitious expeditions even possible. Some women, resourceful and resilient, even traveled with the army as camp followers, providing essential services ranging from cooking and mending to crucial medical care. The devastating aftermath of the battle left thousands of Norse women widowed, forcing them to suddenly take on roles traditionally reserved for men managing households and farms alone. Their remarkable resilience in the face of such catastrophic loss undoubtedly helped Norse society survive the ensuing disaster and chaos. The medical realities of Stamford Bridge were grim by any medieval standard. Battle injuries in this period were frequently fatal, with infection, often claiming as many lives as died from immediate wounds on the field. Viking medical knowledge, while advanced for its time, and based on centuries of practical experience, could do little for men with severe penetrating wounds to the torso or devastating head injuries. Treatment consisted primarily of rudimentary wound cleaning, simple surgery to remove embedded arrowheads or bone fragments, and the application of herbal remedies. The lucky survivors often faced permanent disability and disfigurement, ending their careers as warriors and forcing them to find other, often difficult means of survival in a harsh world. The psychological impact of Stamford Bridge on its survivors cannot be truly quantified, but it must have been profound and enduring. Men who had left Norway full of confidence in victory and dreams of wealth returned defeated, disgraced, and impoverished. Many had witnessed friends and kinsmen cut down before their very eyes in indelible trauma. The survivors faced not just physical hardships and debilitating injuries, but the deep emotional trauma of defeat and the social shame of having fled from battle. Some found solace in newfound religious faith, others in the numbing embrace of drink, while still others sought release in the composition of poignant poetry that bravely transformed defeat into a kind of enduring literary victory, ensuring the memory of their courage lived on. The naval aspects of the Viking expedition deserve meticulous examination. The magnificent longships that carried Hardrada's army represented the absolute pinnacle of Norse maritime technology, a culmination of centuries of shipbuilding innovation. These incredibly versatile vessels, with their characteristic shallow draft and flexible clinker-built construction, could navigate both the treacherous open seas and the narrow, winding, shallow rivers of England with unparalleled ease. Their legendary speed under both sail and oar gave the Vikings a strategic mobility unmatched by any other power in their era. The complex logistics of coordinating a fleet of 300 ships across the North Sea, maintaining formation and executing landings, required exceptional seamanship and an astonishing level of organization. The catastrophic abandonment of most of these precious ships after Stamford Bridge represented a massive, irreplaceable loss of capital investment and vital technological capability for Norway. The intelligence failure that contributed so heavily to the disaster at Stamford Bridge offers crucial lessons that remain highly relevant today for military strategists and leaders. Hardrada's information about English political divisions was largely accurate, but tragically incomplete. He knew about Harold's problems with his rebellious brother Tostig and the looming Norman threat from William, but he fatally failed to appreciate the English king's extraordinary ability to respond with lightning speed and determination to multiple simultaneous threats. The Viking intelligence network, impressive as it was for its time, simply could not provide real-time information about enemy movements and dispositions. This critical limitation, combined with a dangerous overconfidence born of initial success at Fulford, ultimately created the perfect conditions for a catastrophic surprise. The diplomatic context of the 1066 invasions reveals the deeply interconnected nature of medieval European politics and ambition. Hardrada's invasion was arguably coordinated, whether deliberately or coincidentally, with William's Norman expedition. Both ambitious invaders hoped to ruthlessly exploit England's apparent weakness and internal division, viewing it as a ripe target. The Pope's controversial support for William's claim added a powerful religious dimension to what was fundamentally a ruthless struggle for political power and immense wealth. English diplomacy under Harold tragically failed to prevent either invasion, leaving the king to face both formidable threats with military force alone. The ultimate failure of negotiation and political maneuvering made the bloody confrontation at Stamford Bridge inevitable. Climate and agricultural factors, though often understated in historical accounts, played important and sometimes crucial roles in the Viking expedition. The medieval warm period that characterized the 11th century had made Scandinavian agriculture more productive than ever before, supporting larger populations and enabling more ambitious military adventures. The same climatic warming that opened distant Greenland to Norse settlement also created the necessary economic surpluses to fund major military expeditions of this scale. Conversely, the agricultural wealth of England, further enhanced by the same favorable climatic conditions, made it an irresistibly tempting target for ambitious rulers like Hardrada, fueling their desire for conquest. The transformation of Viking military culture by 1066 vividly reflected broader ongoing changes in Norse society itself. The old ideal of the independent warrior seeking individual glory and personal renown was gradually giving way to more organized hierarchical military structures and professional armies. The men who fought at Stamford Bridge were more likely to be retained soldiers serving powerful lords rather than seasonal raiders who returned to their farms in winter. This increasing professionalization of warfare required different economic arrangements, with lords maintaining permanent military households rather than assembling temporary forces for summer raids. The devastating defeat at Stamford Bridge accelerated this transformation by eliminating many traditionalists and reinforcing the need for centralized modern military organization. The linguistic evidence from the Stamford Bridge period provides fascinating insights into the complex cultural interactions of the time. The Old Norse spoken by Hardrada's army was still mutually intelligible with the Old English of Yorkshire, where Scandinavian settlement had been heavy for centuries. This remarkable linguistic closeness facilitated not only intelligence gathering and negotiation, but also highlighted the often artificial nature of ethnic divisions. Many English fighters at Stamford Bridge had Norse ancestry, while some Vikings had been born and raised in England. The battle, in a sense, was as much a civil war, a conflict between closely related peoples, as it was a foreign invasion. The artistic legacy of Stamford Bridge found poignant expression in various medieval media. Skaldic poetry, the complex and highly formal verse form favored by Norse courts, meticulously preserved accounts of the battle that emphasized individual heroism and unwavering courage over strategic failure. English chroniclers, writing in Latin, typically focused on divine providence and the righteous cause of King Harold. Later, medieval artists depicted the battle in illuminated manuscripts and grand tapestries, though these often conflated it with the more famous Battle of Hastings. Each artistic tradition shaped the memory of the event to serve its own contemporary purposes and narratives. The geographical significance of Stamford Bridge extended far beyond its immediate tactical importance. The site strategically controlled the main crossing of the River Derwent, and thus critical access to the city of York from the east. Its selection as a convenient meeting place for receiving hostages and tribute made perfect strategic sense under normal circumstances. The broader geography of Yorkshire, with its intricate river systems and remnants of Roman roads, had attracted Norse settlers for centuries, due to its fertile lands and strategic position. The very landscape itself bore the indelible marks of Scandinavian influence in its place names and agricultural field patterns. The battle, in essence, was fought on ground that was as much Norse in its cultural imprint as it was English. Technological factors beyond mere weapons and armor significantly influenced the battle's outcome. The superior Roman road system that King Harold used for his astonishingly rapid march from London remained far superior to anything available in Scandinavia at the time. English logistics, based on well-organized royal estates and efficient urban centers, could support rapid military movements across land in ways that the Vikings' ship-based system could not match away from navigable water. The developing technology of fortification, though not directly relevant at the open battlefield of Stamford Bridge, formed the broader strategic background of the era. Vikings generally excelled at mobile amphibious warfare. but notoriously struggled against well-fortified positions and sieges. The religious dimensions of Stamford Bridge went beyond simple Christian versus pagan conflict, revealing a more nuanced reality. By 1066, most Norwegians were nominally Christian, though older pagan practices and beliefs often persisted alongside the new faith. The English Church, more thoroughly Christianized, still contained syncretistic elements, blending old traditions with Christian ones. Both armies included zealous Christians, who saw their cause as divinely sanctioned and righteous. The established role of battlefield clergy providing last rites and spiritual comfort to the dying was present on both sides. Religious rhetoric was often skillfully employed to justify the violence, while religious institutions themselves frequently profited from victory through plunder and increased influence. The seasonal timing of the Stamford Bridge campaign closely followed traditional Viking patterns for major expeditions. Late summer and early fall typically provided optimal conditions for both long-distance sailing and intensive campaigning on land before the onset of harsh winter weather. Harvest time meant maximum availability of vital supplies for foraging armies. The approaching winter added a desperate urgency to Hardrada's campaign, as he needed to establish himself firmly before prolonged bad weather made military operations impossible. Harold's unprecedentedly rapid response disrupted this carefully planned timeline, forcing battle before the Vikings were properly established and resupplied. The unseasonably warm weather that initially favored the invasion by allowing a swift sea crossing, ironically, became a significant liability during the battle itself, causing exhaustion among the heavily armored combatants. Social stratification within the Viking army at Stamford Bridge closely mirrored broader Norse society of the time. At the apex stood Harald Hardrada and his jarl's powerful men who seamlessly combined military leadership with political authority and immense economic power. Below them ranked the professional warriors, the huskarls, and hirdmen, elite soldiers, who exchanged dedicated military service for land privileges and a share of plunder. The bulk of the army consisted of free farmers and craftsmen fulfilling their military obligations to their lords, or simply seeking personal profit and glory. At the very bottom were thralls and servants present in supporting roles but typically excluded from direct combat. This established hierarchy profoundly influenced battlefield deployment tactical roles and the crucial post-battle distribution of plunder and honors. The comparative analysis of Stamford Bridge with other major battles of the Viking Age reveals both striking continuities and significant changes in Norse warfare. Like the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 or Hjörungavágr in 986, it powerfully demonstrated the formidable effectiveness of disciplined infantry formations, particularly the shield wall. However, unlike earlier Viking victories, it starkly showed the increasing importance of strategic mobility, rapid intelligence gathering and adapting to unforeseen circumstances. The sheer scale of the battle exceeded most earlier Viking Age engagements, reflecting the vast resources available to an established kingdom like Norway, rather than mere raiding parties. Crucially, the decisive nature of the defeat with no opportunity for the negotiated settlements common in Norse warfare marked a profound departure from traditional Viking military outcomes. Environmental factors beyond just weather profoundly affected the battle's outcome. The terrain around Stamford Bridge, relatively flat with gentle slopes, generally favored the close-quarters combat at which Vikings excelled. The River Derwent provided a natural defensive barrier for the Vikings when they were initially deployed, but it also tragically trapped them when they were surprised and forced to retreat across the narrow bridge. Local vegetation and visibility conditions influenced tactical decisions throughout the battle. The acoustic properties of the battlefield, with the river valley potentially focusing and amplifying sound, added to the psychological impact of thunderous war cries and the deafening clash of weapons. Even subtle factors like the angle of the sun at different times of day played roles in the shifting advantages during the fighting. The economic aftermath of Stamford Bridge extended far beyond Norway, rippling throughout the entire North Sea world. Norse merchants lost immediate access to lucrative English markets, severely disrupting established trade networks that had flourished for centuries. The vast wealth that would have flowed to Scandinavia from a successful invasion instead remained in or returned to England. Craftsmen who specialized in the manufacture of military equipment, from shipbuilders to armorers, faced drastically reduced demand. The widespread disruption of normal economic activity by the prolonged military campaign severely affected both agriculture and nascent industries. Economic recovery took many years and significantly contributed to the lasting reorientation of Norse economies away from large-scale raiding toward more peaceful pursuits like trade and settlement. The demographic consequences of Stamford Bridge profoundly shaped medieval Scandinavia. The catastrophic loss of thousands of young, able-bodied men created severe imbalances in Norse society for a generation. Marriage patterns shifted dramatically as women significantly outnumbered eligible men. Inheritance disputes multiplied as direct heirs died without issue, leading to complex legal and social challenges. Some regions of Norway lost such significant portions of their adult male population that it directly impacted agricultural production and local defense capabilities. This profound demographic shock contributed significantly to political instability and social change across the Norse kingdoms. Population recovery took a generation, by which time Norse society had fundamentally changed, becoming less expansionist and more settled. The rich literary tradition surrounding Stamford Bridge provides invaluable insights into the cultural interpretations of the time. Skaldic poetry, the complex and highly formal verse form favored by Norse courts, meticulously preserved vivid accounts of the battle that typically emphasized individual heroism and unwavering courage over strategic failure. English chroniclers, often writing in Latin, focused on divine providence and the righteousness of King Harold's cause, framing the victory as God's will. Later, medieval artists depicted the battle in illuminated manuscripts and grand tapestries, though these often conflated it with the more famous Battle of Hastings due to the shared year. Each artistic tradition skillfully shaped the memory of the event to serve its own contemporary purposes and narratives, offering different lenses through which to view this pivotal clash.